Well, welcome to another coffee shop and another study. It's going to be great. We have a new coffee mug here at this coffee shop. It's Yehovah in Paleo Hebrew. It's YHVH in English and Yud-He Vav-He in Hebrew. And it's the original name for God. And so anyway, we're going to be taking up where we left off last time. With we saw that the asteroid 2004 MN4 was discovered on March the 15th of 2004, and it just so happened on that same day that the Israeli Knesset had voted, okay, we're going to leave our land. We'll get out. We're being pressured to leave and to make peace with people that don't want peace. We can't work with them, but they're still pressuring us to do it, so we'll just turn it over. And that's where we left off. So we're going to go back to this and follow through with the rest of this story with George W. Bush. And we're going to notice a couple of more instances where the very day that a U.S. president goes against Israel is the very day a catastrophe happens. And it's like you could look at the newspaper and it says that, on the front page, you know, this happened with Israel, and then on the other side, disaster. So it's incredible. It's a pattern we need to recognize because the asteroid is following this same pattern. That's why it's significant. So we're back to the evacuation of Gaza in 2005. And so these are the beautiful Israeli homes in Gush Katif settlement in Gaza. And all of these homes were destroyed by the Israeli government and the Israeli Defense Forces when they left. You know, that was part of the 2005 disengagement process. And so they destroyed everything, or a lot of it. And in all, about 2,500 homes were demolished. And this all because of Bush's roadmap to hell plan. Okay, the Gush Katif residents had constructed over 1,000 acres of greenhouses with beautiful high-tech facilities focused on high-value export crops, pest-free leafy greens, herbs, organic vegetables, cherry tomatoes, peppers, flowers, geraniums, spices, and strawberries. They're very productive, and they had high tech. And these greenhouses, they brought in over $100 million in annual revenue. And so the Israelis dismantled about half of these greenhouses when they were evicted, and then the World Bank purchased the other half and handed it over to the Palestinians. But you know what happened to those? Well, after 20 years of looting and abandonment by the Palestinians, as well as damage from the recent conflict, and none of these exist anymore. Just totally wasted, all this high-tech infrastructure. They can't use it to make a productive society. They can only tear things up. And so it seems like the Israelis are the only ones that can make the land produce. They're the only ones that have the blessing on them to do that. So the nearby Gaza settlement of Kfar Dorum was forcibly evacuated by the military. And here's a couple of pictures of that. And they resisted, but they made them forcibly leave. And this Kfar Dorum home was also destroyed. So this Netzarim settlement was the very last area in Gaza to be evacuated on August the 22nd of 2005. And around midday, hundreds crowded into the synagogue for final prayers. They then marched behind a large wooden menorah with Torah scrolls and a little parade, a farewell tour, before they boarded the buses and left. In all, 21 Jewish settlements in Gaza were evacuated, and about 8,500 Israelis lived there. So additionally, 4 settlements in northern Samaria were also evacuated. Kadam and Ganem residents had previously left their homes, but the final 2 communities were Sanur and Homesh, and they were evacuated on August the 23rd of 2005. And 6,000 Israeli police soldiers, they showed up because they were anticipating a fierce resistance. It wasn't that bad. They got hit a little bit, but not bad. So note to date, they evacuated August the 23rd, 2005. That was the very day the last ones left. And on that same day, Tropical Depression 12 that originated near the Bahamas from a merger of Tropical Wave and Tropical Depression 10, and the next day that tropical depression became Tropical Storm Katrina. And so there's your next, the same day event that's starting to get really serious now. And so on the next day after that, on August 25th, it became Hurricane Katrina. And August 29th, it made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane near Burris, Louisiana. Electrical power was lost in much of New Orleans. The Superdome roof developed 2 holes, and water was pouring into the elevator shaft and stairwell, and approximately 50 major breaches occurred in the levee and flood wall system that protected New Orleans. And 46 of them were by water overtopping the levees, but 4 were structural failures before the water topped them, and that was the serious failures that caused about 80% of New Orleans to be flooded. Katrina became the United States' costliest tropical hurricane with an estimated $150 billion in damage. The hurricane killed 1,392 people, which is eerily similar to the 1,329 Israeli settlers that were evicted on August the 23rd. So the United States paid the price as far as displaced residents. Israel had 10,000. We had over 1 million displaced residents, so that's 100-fold worse damage we received. And as assets lost, Israel lost 23 billion, and we lost 150 billion. That's 7-fold times. So the United States, they really paid the price for dividing Israel. Additionally, the 2005 hurricane season, it had a total of 4 Category 5 hurricanes, the most ever. Think about that. A Category 5 hurricane has a sustained winds of 157 miles an hour, and it's the highest designation we have on the chart. So God's anger was evident. And the bombardment started with Hurricane Emily, which reached 160 mile per hour winds on July 16th, 2005. And interestingly, that was the same day the U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, she hastily rearranged her schedule to fly to Israel to make sure that Israel was going to withdraw, because there were some uprisings and they thought Israel might back out. Oh, they can't. They want to make sure they're going to give up that land, and this hurricane forms, becomes a Category 5 the very day she rearranges her schedule. And then we've already seen the Katrina form the same day that the Israeli residents were evicted from Samaria, and it had a maximum wind speed of 175 miles per hour. And next we had Hurricane Rita, which had wind speeds of 180 miles an hour on September the 21st of 2005. And incidentally, this was the same day that the Gaza Strip officially became recognized as international territory. And so on September the 21st, you had to have a passport to go from Israel to Gaza. And so on that day, we had another Category 5 hurricane. So it's very interesting to see this connection. Finally, Hurricane Wilma obtained sustained winds of 185 miles per hour. So it gets sequentially worse and worse and worse. And on October the 19th, and this day was right in the middle of Israel's celebration of Sukkot, or Tabernacles. And what Wilma is famous for is having the lowest central pressure in Atlantic storm history of 882 millibars. And that's the best indicator of intensity. And then it also had the record for the smallest eye ever observed, with only 2.3 miles in diameter, and you can see it, very small. So it's evident God was ticked. The 2005 Atlantic hurricane season was record-breaking. It had the costliest damage to date, $171 billion, 3,468 deaths. It featured 27 storms with names. That's the most of any season until then. The list of names ran out, as matters of fact, and they had to use Greek letters for the last 6 storms. And so a record of 15 of these storms were hurricane status storms. You have to have 74 miles per hour wind to be a hurricane. And of 7 of these, they became major hurricanes with 111 miles per hour wind. That was Category 3. And then of course we know 4 of the storms became Category 5. So President George W. Bush's desire to settle the Mideast conflict by dividing up God's land, it sure caused the United States a lot of grief and destruction. However, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon did not escape unscathed. He could have said no to Bush's roadmap to hell, but he didn't. He complied with the deranged desires of the U.S. president, and he willingly divided up the land that God had given solely to Israel, and he paid a heavy price, because barely 4 months after he allowed the 10,000 Israelis to be evicted, he went into a coma. And he stayed in that coma for 8 years. And he was a vegetable until he died on January 11th of 2014. So he paid a price for dividing the land. Everyone involved had to pay the price. Get a drink. President George W. Bush was following in the footsteps of his father, George Herbert Walker Bush, and he's the real brainchild of the plan to force Israel to negotiate with their enemies. And so we're going to go to him and see this what started the whole pattern. Let's look what happened when he initiated the process. Bush Sr. began the whole Land for Peace process at the Madrid Conference in 1991. It was co-chaired by him and Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. The conference was attended by Israeli, Egyptian, Syrian, and Lebanese delegations, as well as a joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation. What's significant about this is for the first time all of the parties to the Arab-Israeli conflict had gathered to hold direct negotiations. It was historically unprecedented. And so this was October 30th, 1991. And so President Bush began by addressing them from the Royal Palace in Madrid, Spain. And he said, "What we envision is a process of direct negotiations proceeding along 2 tracks, one between Israel and the Arab states, the other between Israel and the Palestinians. Negotiations are to be conducted on the basis of the UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. And we just saw with President George W. Bush, he was pushing UN Resolution 242, which basically says you got to give up all your land. So this is the whole basis. Before you even begin the negotiations, you've already made the conclusion you're going to have to give all your land up. The very moment that President George H.W. Bush was addressing the conference, as he was standing there speaking, a storm had formed off the New England coast, and it did the most unusual thing. It headed straight inland. And from this AccuWeather map, you can see all the complexities of this new storm. It's called the perfect storm, or here they call it the Halloween storm. At the bottom of the map, Tropical Storm Grace achieved hurricane status on October 28th. On the same day, an area of low pressure developed off the Atlantic Canada at the upper right, and they label it Halloween storm, but as we said, that's really the perfect storm. And meanwhile, an Arctic blast of very cold air sandwiched the two together with the perfect storm, completely absorbing the Category 2, which is 105 miles per hour, Hurricane Grace. So the perfect storm took all the energy out of Grace and absorbed it into itself on October the 30th, 1991. While Herbert Walker Bush is speaking at the Madrid conference, this is happening. Isn't that amazing? The same day, okay? So the perfect storm significantly strengthened during that day, and because of the temperature contrast between the cold air and to the northwest and the warm humidity and remnants of Hurricane Grace. And as you can see, it headed straight towards land, and there's this color-enhanced infrared image of the monster perfect storm at its peak intensity on October the 30th. And here's President Bush's home in Kennebunkport, Maine. He had an oceanfront property. Note that the counterclockwise rotation of the wind in the outer arm is headed straight towards Bush's home. It looks like it's going to make a direct hit, matter of fact. It's obvious that this storm was meant solely for President Bush's residence. Take a break. Now this weather map shows the barometric pressures and location of the eye at the perfect storm's closest approach to the East Coast on October 31st, 1991. It brought the 1020 isobar line of wind directly into the president's home. You can follow that line. This simulation shows the eye making a beeline for Long Island, New York during the entire day of October 30th. And that's when Bush was speaking. Okay? And then suddenly looping down and at the beginning of October 31st. The damage was done at the end of Wednesday, October 30th, the same day that Bush kicked off the Madrid Middle East Peace Conference aimed at forcing Israel to evacuate their land. The Deseret News from October 31st is entitled, "Waves Ravage Bush's Main Vacation Home." President Bush managed to survey his oceanside home 2 days later on Saturday. "It's devastating," he said, "but everything can be repaired." He said he had some insurance, but not enough needed to restore his house. At the height of the storm, 30-foot waves crashed over his home. His home was about 30 feet tall. Okay, and it sits on a little rocky point. The front first floor of the 3-story home was ripped open to the sea, revealing the remnants of what had been their living room, a bedroom, and a family sitting room. Bush said many years of accumulation of books and personal belongings had been destroyed or washed out to sea. In a swampy area, he found a treasured photograph of his father, former Senator Prescott Bush of Connecticut. And in the backyard was a Howard piano, in the family for 30 years, now ruined. 3 of the 4 binoculars he prized were lost. Barbara Bush said, "All that nice living room just went out to sea." The president said he couldn't believe the extent of the damage. "And I've been around the ocean a long time," he said. "Those who have lived around here all their lives have never seen anything like it." And we know why nobody had ever seen anything like this, because nobody else had ever been crazy enough to try to divide Israel. Bush said, "This kind of thing you don't blame on anybody. It's one of the breaks. You don't worry about it. You go on and come back." So President Bush obviously didn't get God's warning. He was totally clueless. He didn't even have the slightest thought that maybe God was trying to get his attention. So he blindly proceeded on to continue the process of dividing Israel, as we'll see. Hurricane Grace had been grace towards Israel from God Almighty, who was watching over his land. Hurricane Grace supplied enormous energy into the perfect storm, which temporarily achieved hurricane status with 75-mile-an-hour winds. They didn't name it, though. The next name after Grace was Henry, and it was such a short duration they didn't name it. But it should have been called Hurricane Henry, and interestingly, Henry means ruler of the household. And so the message from these last 2 hurricanes, back to back, God has grace towards Israel, and he alone is the ruler of the house, including the Bush's house. President Bush told reporters, "Unfortunately, the sea won this round. We'll go on to the next one." What he never realized was he wasn't fighting against the sea, he was fighting against God. And the God that watches over Israel. And little did he know, he didn't have a single chance of winning the next round either. We're going to see. Okay, we're coming to 10 months later. These peace talks are still proceeding. We're down to round 6. It's August the 24th of 1992. And so it's coming around to Washington, D.C., these talks, for the first time. They've been going around the world, different cities. This was the 6th round. And Israeli negotiators met separately with Syrians, Lebanese, and a joint delegation of Jordanians and Palestinians. And they arrived over the weekend, and they were to begin the talks, and they did. They began them on Monday, August the 24th, 1992. Hurricane Andrew had been brewing over the previous week, and had become a Category 5 hurricane 1 day earlier, August the 23rd. On August the 24th, 1992, the same day that began the 6th round of the Middle East peace talks, Andrew came into Homestead, Florida, a full-blown Category 5 hurricane sporting 175-mile-an-hour winds. Here's the last image from the Miami radar station from the National Hurricane Center, taken at 4:35 in the morning, just moments before the storm blew it off its mounts. This is the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, infrared image of Hurricane Andrew making landfall in Dade County at 5 a.m. That's the very morning they're to begin the talks. And 1 hour later, here's another infrared image from NOAA and their GO-7 satellite. Hurricane Andrew was the most destructive hurricane to ever hit Florida in terms of structures damaged or destroyed, and it remained the costliest in financial terms until Hurricane Irma surpassed it 25 years later. So here's an aerial view of Dade County, Florida. Andrew destroyed 63,500 houses, $27 billion in damage, 65 people died. Andrew was also the strongest hurricane to make landfall in the United States in decades and the costliest hurricane to strike anywhere in the country until Katrina passed it in 2005. Andrew is only one of 4 tropical cyclones to make landfall as a Category 5. So that's a little unusual, and due to the hurricane's impact and damage, the World Meteorological Organization retired the name Andrew from its list of hurricane names. It'll never be used again, and so that's a pretty good example of the magnitude of God's favor towards Israel. Okay, yeah. So we've seen 3 examples of what happens when a U.S. president goes against Israel. 3 same-day events, disasters, catastrophes that happen. And we saw Katrina, we saw the perfect storm, and we saw Hurricane Andrew, as well as this asteroid. So we're got four historical examples of same-day events at this point, but there's more. So you're not going to want to miss the next video.